In this lesson, we'll cover guide grids. So you may ask yourself, well, what is a guide grid and what does it do? Well, when we look at this sheet, we actually see multiple viewports. And let's say we had another sheet for level 2 or level 3 or east or west elevations, and you want the viewports on those additional sheets to be aligned or positioned in the same location on the sheet as they are on this sheet. You know, if you move a viewport around, there's no way of snapping a given point. That's where the guide grid comes in. Basically, it's a grid allowing you to snap your viewports to an intersection of a crossing within the guide grid. So let's take a look at that. To create a guide grid, first of all, open a sheet that has viewports, then go to your View tab. Once on the View tab in the Sheet Composition panel, click Guide Grid. If you already have a guide grid, it'll list under the existing. If you don't, create a new guide grid. I'm going to give it the name just Guide Grid 1. Click OK. Now, by default, the guide grid is drawn covering the entire sheet. And this can kind of be, let's say, a little monotonous at times because it can hide lines and it's real busy. Also, the spacing within the grid may not be what you desire. So let's look at how we can modify those. First of all, let's look at the spacing. If you move your mouse over the edge of the grid, it'll highlight, and go ahead and left click it. Once you left click it, you'll see a guide spacing option in the property area on the left. And you can change that. 25 millimeters, roughly 1 inch. You also see drag handles on the edge of the grid. This is very similar to crop, meaning you don't need to keep the grid visible across the entire drawing. You could resize this or think of it as cropping it to only see a visible portion of it. And then move the grid just to an area that you're working on or positioning a specific view. Now the grid still crosses the entire sheet. What we're doing though is just changing the window of looking at the grid so you don't see it across the entire sheet. To deselect the grid, just click in the background. Now, how does it work? Well, let's zoom in around this viewport on the very top. First thing we need to do is select the viewport. I'm going to move around the viewport itself until it highlights. Go ahead and left click it. And to verify you selected it, you should see Modify Viewport on the ribbon. And in the property area, it should say Viewport 1, meaning one viewport is selected. Now, all you have to do is use the Move command. And for example, move your grid lines or level lines to an intersecting point on the blue grid. And I'll zoom in a little more to illustrate this. I'm going to start the Move command from my Modify toolbar. I'm going to move over an intersection of my grid lines and or level lines, click it, and then move that intersection to an intersection of the blue grid. Click it. That then moves this view into a position, locking it to the grid. And you would do the same thing to your additional sheet in the views on that sheet. Now, if you wanted to move another view, simply mouse over the grid, select it, and then just drag this viewport window of the grid to the new location, and then repeat the process. Select the viewport, zoom in, choose the Move command, select an intersection of a grid or level line, and then move it to where you want it positioned on the actual blue grid, and then zoom back out. So in this lesson, what we looked at was creating the actual guide grid. We talked about how the guide grid can be used to position views in a specific location on one sheet and another sheet so those views line up from sheet to sheet. We looked at resizing the grid spacing and also cropping down the view of the grid so it doesn't cover the entire sheet. Lastly, we looked at moving our viewports by aligning our level or grid lines within the viewport to an intersection on the grid.